Well, I think that's a very relevant question, how states can impact the conversation on weapons governance, because sometimes we think that small states do not have a role in these sort of conversations, but they do. Here at the United Nations, most of the conventions relied on a consensual basis approach to reach decisions and to adopt any sort of action point. In that regard, for instance, I can give you two examples. In the case of Costa Rica, we participated a group of governmental experts on emerging technologies for lethal autonomous weapon systems. And we have had very substantial conversations in the last 2 years. We have talked about the characteristics of these autonomous weapon systems. We have talked about potential military applications. And most importantly, we have talked about the human element and the human control, cross-cutting perspective that we should have towards analyzing these weapon systems and potential opportunities for policy development and also for regulations. And in that regard, I can tell you that small states have their voice heard, and we act as a sort of balance in the conversation vis-a-vis bigger states that are developing these sort of weapons. So I think that in that regard, sometimes our role is underestimated, but it's a very important one. And another example I can give you is within the Arms Trade Treaty. Costa Rica is one of the founders of the treaty. It's a very young treaty, it's only 5 years old, but we have been very active in promoting its implementation and universalization. And when we look at the rates of violence and criminal action in my region, in Central America and Latin America in general, the diversion of small and light weapon systems is a very, very important concern, not only to governments, but to private sector and civil society. And in that regard, we have also been working to develop better practices and regional mechanisms to ensure that we can regulate not only the trade, but also prevent illicit traffic of these weapons. So I do feel that small states play a very important role in this regard as weapons governance is concerned. Well, following up on our previous question, I think that from the Central American perspective, weapons governance is fundamental to assuring prosperous societies. We're aiming at accomplishing the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 16, which aims to achieve peaceful societies. And in that regard, our participation in all disarmament conventions and non-proliferation discussions is super relevant. I can tell you, for instance, that also for other conventions like biological weapons, we are dealing at dual use of certain developments like biotechnology, nanotechnology, not to mention artificial intelligence. And we do feel that if there are new weaponry being developed, we need to contemplate the possibility that these weapons may pose a risk to the human being, because we need to go back to the human-centered approach as we deal with weapons governance. We have to respect human rights law, international humanitarian law, and really promote compliance. And I do feel that in the current tensions, the global landscape, especially between big powers, weapons governance remains more important than ever, including, I would say, the participation of smaller states at the table, because we have equal participation when we discuss these issues, especially here at the United Nations. And as I said, I do think that our active engagement will impact that our societies that are part of the global community are closer to a more inclusive and prosperous development. I think that the role of regional organizations as they interlink with national and multilateral institutions is transcendental, because they act as a bridge. Sometimes we're aiming at developing a common language to educate people on the potential risk, not only of weapons of mass destruction, but on other existential threats, like, for instance, climate change. And I think that regional organizations play a fundamental role in making the conversation accessible to people on the street. I can give you an example, for instance, OPANAL, which is the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, that was created after the ratification of the Tlatelolco Treaty in 1969, aims at promoting this sort of awareness. We not only are the first nuclear weapon-free zone in the region, but through OPANAL we have been able to engage more globally with other organizations on the multilateral level, and other nuclear weapon-free zones, were created after the Treaty of Tlatelolco, in large because of the active participation of OPANAL. And they also act, as influencers in national institutions for the promotion of disarmament and non-proliferation, but also as a way to increase awareness from people on the streets and as to the risk. I also think that making the connection to climate change, I used to work on this sort of work, this line of work for sustainable development and low carbon economies. And most of the achievements that one can accomplish at the national level are possible because of the empowerment that regional institutions give and the link to the global agenda. So I think that regional organizations play a fundamental role in educating people, in making synergies and scaling up efforts at the national level, and also as honest brokers. They are really trustworthy organizations that can leverage the work that is being done at the national level.